Hi, welcome to my studio in this lesson about the beaded coil. Just as a point of reference, the beaded coil technique is found inside one of my books. It's the Be Creative Art Quilts, as well as many other beading techniques that I have developed. Here is what a finished beaded coil looks like, and this is photographed within the book. Let's take a look at the completed beaded coil stitch. You will notice in the straightaways of the coil, the beads are laying perpendicular to the object they're being wrapped around. You can always see in this example that by using different sizes of beads, this is a row of size 6 beads, you can add dimension to your beaded coil. Here's the basics of how it's made. As you can see here, I have taken a piece of cording. It's about the size of clothesline. In fact, it is cotton clothesline. And what I have done is I've put it in the position I want the coil to be, and then doing a running stitch, I have basted the coil down in place. You can see that on the back side of my fabric and my batting, that I have done nothing fancy, just a line of tacking down the coil in place. Take another look at the front side. You'll notice the difference in the two ends. This end I've allowed to fray, and that can be a design element in your project. The other end I had glued together the fraying parts, and when it was dry, I then basted the clothesline in place. The reason I didn't start right at the edge of the clothesline is because if I do that, the first couple of rows I put on are going to fall right off of the edge into the fabric. And we want to keep accentuating the roundness of the coil. So I've started my wrapping of beads inward, and when I'm finished, I can then go back and make wraps of beads that have less beads in them because this area is smaller than the main part of the clothesline. I rarely use a hoop when I'm beading. The only reason I'm using a hoop now is we are going to be taking a lot of tiny, tight stitches, and that can make your fabric pucker. So to avoid that, I am going to put the clothesline that is our armature inside of a small hoop. As I mentioned earlier, when you are in a straight portion of the coil, you will be wrapping rows of beads perpendicular to the coil, touching each other in a very tight fashion. We've come to a curve at this point here, so I'm just going to skip ahead for a minute and show you how to construct the beads in a straightaway of the coil and then go back to that corner. You are always going to pass your needle and thread through the fabric slightly under the coil before you wrap a row of beads. I have done that. Now I've put on a length of beads, and what I'm going to do is measure to see if it will cover the coil and touch the fabric on the other side, and I did a measure and it looks pretty good. So now I'm going to pass the needle and thread through the fabric slightly under the coil, making sure that my first row of beads is perpendicular to the coil, and it is. The next row I'm going to repeat what I did with the first one, but have this row butt up next to the first row that I just constructed. Needle and thread comes out slightly under the coil. I'm going to pick up a length of beads and measure. Now, depending on the color of the beads or even varying sizes in one color, your count may not always be exactly the same. And so that's why I always recommend that you measure this. So you push the beads down to the fabric, wrap them around the coil, and then measure. I think I need one more bead. So I'm going to put on a bead, slide it down to the fabric, take another measure, looks good, and pass my needle and thread through the fabric to the wrong side of the fabric, slightly under the coil. You would continue doing the same technique, and you could change colors of your beads or sizes of your beads if you wanted to add more texture. So let's go now and see how we're going to construct the row of beads that is going to be inside the curve. I'll remind you once again that as you're constructing the rows of beads, you always want the beads to lay perpendicular to your coil, and we've done that to this point. If I continue with another row of beads, it is not going to be perpendicular anymore because we do have a curve in our coil. So this is how we make an adjustment so that we can still cover the coil with beads, but get ourselves around the corner and the curve as well. So what I've done is I am going to leave a pie-shaped wedge of coil showing, and I've brought my needle and thread through the fabric to the right side, slightly under the coil, at about the point where if I make a wrapping row of beads, it will be once again perpendicular to my coil. And there I have a start. So I'm going to add a few more beads and then take my measure, pushing them down to the fabric always, so there's very little thread showing between the beads. I wrap it around. It looks to me like I need 2 more beads, and I will do that. Taking my measure, looks better. Once again, the needle and thread is going to pass through the fabric slightly underneath the coil. There. Now, you can see what has happened as I've realigned the next row of beads to be perpendicular. We have a pie-shaped wedge of the coil that is not covered, but the distance here is far greater than the distance in the curve between the row of beads. That means that at certain points in time here, we're still going to be wrapping the coil with a row of beads, but we have to keep the curve as is and not have lines of beads wrapping over other lines of beads, because that will not look good in the curve. So what I'm doing here is I have a shorter row of beads that I have been using, and it's still covering the coil just fine. Instead of putting on more to get a complete measure, I'm just going to pass the needle and thread through the fabric slightly underneath the coil to start covering the space, the pie-shaped space. Once again, needle and thread comes out slightly under the coil and through just the fabric, never the coil. We're wrapping rows, we're not actually sewing rows of beads to the coil. The coil is our armature. Push a partial row back. Looks like use a couple more beads, but it is going to be a shorter row so that we can keep the tight inner curve. That looks good. Pass the needle and thread through the fabric slightly under the coil but not through it. Pull tight, and you can see how we're filling in the curved area so that we can handle that curve and go on to having lines of beads that are perpendicular to the coil. I get the needle and thread through the fabric under the coil, then I'm going to load my needle again. Push the beads down to the fabric, take a measure. Pretty well covers, but I think 1 more will be needed. Measuring again. Slide the needle and thread through the fabric where the coil touches the fabric, but not through the coil. Pull tight. As you can see, we're filling in this area quite nicely. You can also tell that we're seeing some of the color of the coil coming through these rows. And to make sure that doesn't happen, you want to have your coil be a color or a value that is similar to the beads you are using. In this instance, because I only had white clothesline, before starting, I could have painted it with fabric paint and let it dry, or use a permanent marker that was more in the color or value of the beads that I was using. So now that you know the basics of the beaded coil, let's go look at some examples of how I've used them in my art quilts. Remember, the larger the piece of rope or coil you use, the larger your finished beaded coil will be. For the cat's tail here, I actually used a cording that is used to tie back draperies. And then to make the tail even larger and more fluffy, I used size 6 seed beads, which are quite large, and punctuated them with what's called a lentil bead to give the illusion that the cat's tail is realistic. Here is an example of making a basket handle. I've used here all size 11 seed beads, and the cording is about as thick as what the demonstration was when I had my fabric in my hoop a few minutes ago. If you like these beaded panties, I do have a kit for sale on my website. Here's another example of the beaded coil, and in this case I used a piece of coil which was thinner in diameter than on the basket handle. And I'm still using size 11 seed beads, but you can see the difference between using a thin cording and a slightly larger cording, both using size 11 seed beads. One thing I did not cover in this video is, besides using cording for your armature, you can also construct a fabric piece that is filled with batting, so it gives us the plumpness of cording. And when I make the dragonfly, I base down the dragonfly body, which would be this, and then I cover the dragonfly body with size 11 beads, but the tail is made with another stitch called the beading back stitch. I teach this dragonfly in a workshop, but the directions are also in the book, Be Creative Art Quilts. So you've seen several examples from a technique that's in my book, Be Creative Art Quilts, called the beaded coil. And if you've noticed, the piece I have hanging here is the piece that is on the cover of the book, Be Creative Art Quilts.